Oh. Oh, man. Oh. All right. We got our results.
We're waiting for a couple more people. All right.
All right. When must you test for PCBs? Before the job starts, 50% said that one. During the job, 8, 0 at the end, and don't have to test. The 42%, ding, 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 you won the prize. Don't know what we're giving out today, but I know. Module 3 of a PCB awareness class. That's the prize. Yeah, so this is crazy, right? There's, as we're going to see, there's not a requirement to conduct PCB testing before a job starts on the federal level. However, one of the things that we're going to see is that states are starting to become stricter on what they're requiring. And again, this is a potential work issue. So, you know, anybody who's taking the class today, if you've got any ideas how we can make sure that the folks who do IUPAT work development, organizing, any of that kind of stuff, you know, we can get some of this information in their hands. And Jim and Wayne did remind me, it's been so long, but I did put together a PCB fact sheet, one for IUPAT members and then one for IUPAT contractors and members, a little bit about, you know, what PCBs are and such. I don't know what happened, if that got rolled out or not. I think it looked like I developed it last, I don't know, what was it? No, by last, I mean 2019, November. You know, back then. But what we can do is I can speak with Gavin and see if we can't, you know, reformat that, pretty it up, and roll it out. Again, to try to be proactive and ahead of, you know, the potential work that's coming. Do we have any comments or questions left over from yesterday? How about Wayne or Jim? Do you guys have anything you want to add or discuss what we covered yesterday? Any loose ends?
No, I think we're there.
All right.
Yeah, just that fact sheet, Barney.
What's that?
Just the fact sheet.
Okay.
That
You
we
guys
had.
got that okay?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, good. All right, so, you know, again, I went through a couple of slides here actually with some of the promotional materials that Jim, Wayne, and I presented at the FIF 2019. And then I did scope out for some news articles, and lo and behold, PCBs were quite heavily presented in the news this year, because of course it's 2020. Why not throw a significantly toxic, you know, contaminated pollutant out there as well? So this is what, you know, a report that was done in Massachusetts. So the Massachusetts School Building Authority said that 53% of more than 1,800 schools in Massachusetts that were built between the 50s and the 70s contain PCBs. That's a pretty significant amount. So, you know, more than half. The thing is once they find that out, they got to present that. And so that does have to be, you know, abated. So Wayne mentioned this, Senator Ed Markey's office developed a robust PCB awareness report. You know, this isn't a training or anything like that. It's just a report to the public in Massachusetts about how prevalent PCBs are in the environment, in our buildings, you know, who might be subjected or at risk to being exposed to these. And, you know, thanks to Wayne, we actually, Jim and I and Wayne met with, I think, one of his staff members. Again,
Yeah, Evan L. Joseph.
Yeah, you want to chat about that, Wayne?
Well, it's just that we reached out to Ed Markey's office and we spoke with one of his senior aides. Her name is just Avenel Josephs, and we got the ball rolling a little bit, but then he had a pretty contentious election that he has won, and then Now with COVID and everything else, we just haven't been able to get back in touch with him. But we will be reaching back out to see if we can help him in any way push this forward.
Yeah, so my feeling was, on the call that we had with her, Marky's very open to collaborating with us to basically, this is a good workforce that can help promote developing an actual worker standard like we have for asbestos and lead. And that's one of our goals. It's a higher and lofty goal, and we might not see its outcome for a couple of years, as typical for developing a standard, but who knows? In this report, I advise folks to grab this and read through. It's a really good, well done piece of work that they did. So that was nice to see. These are just a few PCBs in the news that we grabbed. Some of this is actually in the worker course, but these are just a bunch of different recent news articles, in the last couple of years about where PCBs are, things that have been popping up. Even there's one at the bottom here, PCB cleanup planned on Newburyport Rail Trail. So, this stuff is on roads. There's a recent article about Texas. They're trying to clean up PCBs on some of their roads because it's mixed in road material that they would use. So the stuff is unfortunately everywhere, as is seen by what's in our food, right? Like we learned yesterday. This is just some stuff that I just grabbed this morning while I was getting ready for the course. Monsanto to pay $95 million over PCB pollution in Washington State. And this is a massive one. So Bayer is connected to Monsanto. I don't know if Bayer is their parent company or vice versa. But a U.S. judge rejects $648 million contamination settlement. The reason why is the judge didn't think that the settlement went far enough and that it actually would potentially shield Bayer from future lawsuits when other things might come up. These are pretty staggering dollar values, right? Lord knows they got the cash in their bank because they made it pretty much off of, the citizens of the US. They got away free and clear producing the stuff and then disposing of it in ways that weren't ethical, right? So this is why we're seeing this. And not to be left out, I had to throw something. Even New Hampshire is like, oh man, you messed up our state too. So they're going to go after Monsanto as well. And these are articles just from this year. Actually some good news, right? Because to clean this stuff up, it is very expensive, especially if it's out in the environment. That's why it's nice if we can reach this stuff while it's still on a bridge or a tower or in a public building, before it gets out into a contaminated state. All right, so now we're going to get into regulations, guidelines, and workers' rights. And you're going to see this is a bit convoluted. I wish I could present something like the asbestos worker standard or lead standard, but we just don't have anything like that. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to show a bunch of regulations that do connect to PCBs under different agencies. And we're going to try to make a plan of how we can protect workers, through this stuff. And that's what I have to do, sometimes with specific hazards that don't have a standard to protect workers. For instance, like heat stress. I created a pretty significant opinion paper for local 689, a steelworker union out at Ohio on a Department of Energy site, because they have massive, time and time again, heat stress issues for their workers because they have to dress up in full, either level C to level A PPE, go into these contaminated buildings with, leftover nuclear fuel and material, and clean it up and get rid of the equipment there to decontaminate it and decommission those buildings. And there wasn't a federal, standard to help me do that, but I did have great stuff throughout the Department of Navy. MSHA has some stuff under the Mine Safety Act. There are some state guidance, and there's a lot of research out there about how devastating heat stress can be. So I was able to piece something together that the union was able to, enforce some protections for their workers. And they also brought Department of Energy to the table with that. So we can do things like that. It's a pain in the butt, and you have to, have the time and the resources to be able to do something like this. So it would be easier if we just had a PCB standard, but we don't. Mainly what happens is just like if you've done any lead courses, you know, or even asbestos courses, the bulk of that, when you're required to take a class, it's to do what? Typically, why do we take what's that?
Identification
What's that, Dave?
identification of this, of the
Yep.
hazard.
Yep. Who's really requiring those courses when we take a lead abatement or an asbestos abatement course?
The employers.
The employers. What's the federal regulator that's requiring these?
OSHA,
Department of
yeah.
Labor,
Not OSHA. OSHA doesn't
Department of
cover
Labor?
public health abatement. It's EPA, right? It's EPA and state Department of Health or environmental departments, because they don't want, you know, that asbestos or lead to be disturbed and then get released and become a fugitive emission into the environment, where it's going to hurt the public or the environment. So we're actually taking these, you know, 32-hour worker classes and 40-hour supervisor classes, et cetera, to make sure that we can properly contain and abate these hazardous materials. You know, typically worker protection is not really focused on in those classes, which is, thankfully, we do have an asbestos and a lead rule, which, you know, those courses will have some citation to, but those aren't worker protection classes by any means. So again, we've got PCBs here. The way that they're handled is through the EPA to protect public health when they are found. If you're looking for, you know, specific worker protections, it's not going to be in there, although the methods that they suggest, and they're suggesting, it's not as strong as the EPA model requirements for asbestos or lead. If you abate the stuff the way EPA is suggesting that you do, it is going to lead to worker protection, but it's still not the same thing. You know, like we've got a very strict asbestos rule for workers. So there are a number of different agencies that regulate PCBs, and it is kind of a mess. Most of them are under EPA. We've got the Toxic Substances Control Act, CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Reauthorization, Cleanup, and Liabilities Act, NIPDES, which deals with release of material into the air, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. And then we've got stuff under FDA. We do have, I have HAZCOM under here because we can, you know, try to tie worker protection into HAZCOM if you're working around any hazardous material. Although waste is not, you know, under HAZCOM, you do have to be educated about that. And as we saw yesterday, unfortunately, we've got a lot of materials, building materials that are new that a EPA team member might use that do have PCBs in them. So we can at least get some protection for that if you're using a new product. And we do have some PELs, and we'll cover those. Then there's, of course, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, which are guides, right? It's guidance. And then Department of Transportation. They've got some requirements of how you not just ship this stuff, but the DOT covers, you know, as you know, pipelines. And, you know, so if you're doing wraps and things like that to protect pipelines from corrosion, you know, there's some requirements there that also connect back to EPA. So what's the conclusion here? It's a mess. We don't have a good solid worker protection rule, but there is quite a bunch of stuff on the books. So EPA did ban these, you know, in 1979. It's pretty stringent as far as what happens once you do identify this stuff. Again, does not directly regulate worker exposure. And they prohibit employer PCB use activities, reducing the number, you know, of workers that are exposed, and the limit the exposure through what they require an employer to do once they do find and you go to abate the stuff. 40 CFR 761 is where you will find the EPA PCB rule. It's got 19 subparts and 6 appendices, so it's fairly large. And again, we're not going to dive into this stuff deeply because this is an awareness level, but during the worker course, we really get into the stuff because we're connecting it. The goal of this class, right, is to make workers aware of PCB hazards and some of the stuff that goes along with that. our worker class that we have is actually going to qualify folks to be able to safely abate this stuff, not just in line with what the EPA says, but what we feel as a labor organization for protecting our members, right? So that's what's going to be in that course. So what EPA did is they defined what makes a remediation waste. It includes contaminated soil and specific cleanup, anything that's 1 ppm or more in unrestricted use in high occupancy areas. So if you find that you've got contamination that's got PCBs as part of that, and it's 1 ppm, and it's in a high use area or high occupancy area, that's got to be remediated. And they defined it where somebody might spend, up to 335 hours or more per year. So what could cover an area like this? What do you think is an area that people might hang out in, for up to 335 hours a year?
Parks and playgrounds.
Yeah, parks and playgrounds, absolutely. What else?
Dining areas,
What's that?
dining areas,
Could be, yeah.
places to eat.
Think of all those public buildings.
Libraries.
Yeah, libraries, right?
Schools.
Schools. Right. So anywhere where you're going to have that potential for occupancy.
Schools.
And this is the rule, or so let's understand the weight of this language. May be present. It doesn't mean, your kid or your grandkid is going to be at that playground, every day for an hour. They might be, right? So, and that's important because you don't have a crystal ball in the future. You don't exactly know how land or area use is going to be, but you can have a general idea. So they have that qualifying phrase in there.
Would that include schools then?
Yes. He asked about schools, Barney.
Yeah. That
Definitely the schools.
Yep. Key is you got to find it first. So if it's there but nobody tested for it, it's like what if a tree falls in the woods, is no one around? Does it make a sound? I mean, right? But this is exactly what it is. So if there are PCBs there, but we don't test for them, are they really there? Well, for the school board and the administrators of the school, no, they're not. So under TSCA, they're regulated there. And again, they were banned in 79. Covers manufacturing, use, processing, and how we dispose of these things. So the FDA, unfortunately, as we saw, a lot of our food supply is contaminated with PCBs. These are just some limits that they have. Yes, included infant foods. So 0.2 ppm, it's in eggs, dairy products, fish and shellfish, and poultry and red meat. And you'll notice, like from eggs down, I mean, a lot of the stuff contains, fats. So this is, we learned yesterday that PCBs like to concentrate in fatty material. They're also a designated hazardous air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. They're regulated by the Clean Water Act, so it regulates discharge into PCBs. And come on, my mouse is behaving badly. This is one example of a chart that came from a state, a wildlife service that looks at PCBs and fish, freshwater fish. So right now, I've got this little stat over here. There are 1,084 fish advisories issued through 40 states. So that, I think that's pretty significant, right? This is something that shouldn't be in the fish. We should be able to go catch them and eat them at our heart's content. But nonetheless, there are a number of states that have warnings for these things. EPA regulates PCB levels in lakes and streams. So it's a fairly small concentration. It's 0.17 parts per trillion of water. That's a very tiny amount. Now, if I were to, to drink that water, it might not necessarily affect me too much unless I'm doing it over and over again. But one of the issues is that level, as we learned yesterday, is really going to bioconcentrate from, the sediment into the plankton, the shellfish, and right up into the big fish that we eat. If you swim in water like that, it's not, necessarily going to be a significant risk for you, but it's really an issue of contaminating the wildlife in there. That could eventually make its way into our food stream. But with that said, I would not want to be drinking water that contains 0.17 parts per trillion of PCBs on a daily basis. PCBs are regulated contaminant under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So this is what you're allowed to have in municipal water. The goal is 0 ppm, thankfully, but they do allow up to 0.5 parts per billion. Right, so if you look at what EPA is saying can be in our drinking water, it's significantly higher than what can just be in a regular body of water due to the bioconcentration effect. This to me is crazy. Having a max, I like the idea of a 0 goal, but it should be a lot smaller than this because we know how long it can stay in our body and how it concentrates. And like we said yesterday with the half-life, right? If you're at that 0.5 ppb, how much is that going to concentrate in your body, and then how long is it going to take for it to get out of there, and where is going to be that health effect limit of how much you've got in your system. So it's unfortunate. I myself, I do have well water, and I've got a double filter system. I've got a general carbon filter and a high particulate filter on my general household water. Then I've got a secondary one on the refrigerator of the stuff that I drink. We drink a lot of water in the house, and I don't need to be putting stuff in my body that shouldn't be there. Discharges, spills, and accidental release. So anything that's at or above 1 pound containing PCB material has to be reported to the NRC. What does this mean? Let's say if you've got, a mixed PCB waste and you've got, 11-pound bucket of it, and, you dump it on the ground, you're going to have to call and report that to the EPA National Response Center line if it's greater than 1 ppm of its total mixture. So that's a pretty small amount. EPA requires companies to follow the rules and regulations of Hazardous Waste Management Program, where they have to test, transport, store, and dispose of PCBs. Now, here's where there's some nuance. So let's say if you did a demolition of a building and it was built in 1965, that waste has to be tested before it goes to a landfill. So now, are you going to test for PCBs or not? If it gets to the landfill and you've got a landfill that does their own testing, you could be in trouble if you show up at the gate. So it behooves, waste haulers to know what that mixed waste is that they're, trying to deliver.
So is that an automatic? Is that part of the programmed, hey, we're demoing this building, this is what's got to happen, and we have to test, or? Yeah,
so good question. So like with asbestos, you have to test the building if it was, built before 79 or earlier for asbestos waste. I'm not familiar. I'll get an answer for you tomorrow. If you're going to demo a building, do you have to test for PCB waste? If that's a requirement beforehand, it should be. We have it for lead, we have it for asbestos. I'm not familiar off the top of my head with the EPA statute. Good question. I'll get you an answer tomorrow. EPA regulates the disposal of caulking, soil, and other PCB contaminated materials. That might have been contaminated from the caulking if concentrations exceed 50 ppm. The only way you're going to know that is to test. And then again, that's an issue. And this is something to look at. So here we have some original caulking on the building and some new stuff. Look at the original concentration, 215,000 ppm. Good Lord, right? That's very high. Well, we're going to put some PCB free new stuff in, right? Well, here's stuff from the 1990s. No, it was not PCB free. 16 to 215 ppm. That was put into this building as new stuff in the 90s, right? So again, just because you've got something and the PCBs were banned, we showed you, during the first day that you're still, you can still have PCBs in caulking, right? So be careful of this. PCBs are specifically mentioned in the Superfund regulations as far as reportable release quantity of 1 pound that I mentioned. And CERCLA, from CERCLA, we've got that HAZWOPER regulation, right? The Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response. I don't know if anybody has taken those courses, like the 40-hour site worker course with its annual refresher. We also have, emergency response side of the coin of that standard. It's a very good standard. So like if you can do emergency response awareness level for like a course, operations course, and then they've got some higher ones for folks who are meant to actually go into a hot zone where there was a uncontrolled chemical release and try to fix it. That's a great standard, and it's got a lot of worker protection in it, and it's held up well through the courts since it's enacting in 1987. And PCBs are connected to worker protection under this law. So that means if you're dealing with hazardous waste that contain PCBs, there are some strong worker protections there. But if you're just going to abate PCBs, you're left with the Pell. So this is from the 40 CFR 761 EPA standard. It basically gives you, a flow reasoning of what you have to do for reporting and managing PCB remediation waste. If it's not a PCB remediation waste, you don't have to worry about it. If it is, it gives you some different avenues to go through. You can self-implement a cleanup. There's a performance-based disposal option, and then there's a risk-based cleanup and disposal. The risk-based one has to deal with, you do air sampling, and you've determined that you've got, PCBs in the air. So you're going to go through a process. Performance-based, I believe, is bulk sampling. But we're going to cover this in the worker course very closely, where we've got an activity where, the participants in that class are going to be able to go through and determine what wastes are what from looking at the standard. So we want workers to really understand what they're getting into when they're abating PCBs. Unfortunately, I'll say it again, hopefully we'll be able to, as the IUPAT leading the charge, get a worker protection rule for PCBs on the books. That's a nice big goal, and I love big goals. So, however, we do have some Pels. We've got 2 Pels, one for 42% chlorine PCBs, one for 54%. And given that these are, probable human carcinogens, however, any exposure is just too much. As I mentioned yesterday, the Center for Disease Control on their cancer page, they say any exposure to a carcinogen will increase your risk. It's never no risk. We do not know what the cutoff is. If it's a half a ppm of PCBs can promote cancer. If it takes 100 ppm, we don't know. Another important thing to understand is OSHA and NIOSH, they use the name chlorodiphenyl. So with chemical names, you can actually reorder things depending upon what it is. So instead of saying polychlorinated biphenyls, they're saying chlorodiphenyls, not PCB. So that's how it's listed. So if you were to use I don't have any of my props here. Can't believe I don't have a pocket guide at the ready. I usually always do. Anyway, if you're looking up PCBs in the NIOSH pocket guide or something, you're going to want to use this name.
Does everybody have wiser.com on your phone? You still got it, Bernie?
Yeah, I don't know if I downloaded it.
I got a question for you. If there are testing procedures that have to be done for waste, why aren't they testing it before? Because we're generating waste, so it's going to be tested afterwards anyhow.
So here's the key, I gotta find a good way to say this because it is a spider web of confusion. Let's take a school. If a school has you do some renovation and it's only with caulking, they don't have to test it. If it's tested and it's found that it's PCBs, then they have to go through the abatement procedure to get that abated, and it increases the cost dramatically.
That's
Not only that, they're now going to have to go through and determine what PCB landscape looks like in that whole building. That's how the rule reads. So if you don't do it, it's out of sight, out of mind. Once you do it, you have to take care of that problem.
Doesn't that absorb into the surrounding material too
It
then?
does, yeah,
does.
right. We showed that on day one, right? The requirement of the law is if you've got PCBs in caulking or material, you actually have to take a bore sample into the surrounding material to see at what level, if at all, the PCBs contaminated that surrounding material. So I'll go through tonight and see if I can't come up with some kind of guidance letter from EPA if they've listed such a thing. I don't recall finding one when I was going through the worker course, developing that, but who knows? I could have missed something and something else could have came out within that time. So
Barney?
I'll look and see if I can answer that question for you tomorrow.
Hey, Barney,
Yeah,
June 29th of 2020, the EPA put out a guidance letter. It says it just recommends that building material be suspected of PCB be tested directly. That's all it says.
recommending, yeah.
It just recommends. But when it goes to schools, if it's built later, it doesn't say shall, but it goes into the testing procedures and stuff like that.
Can you forward
So-
that link to me, Jim?
Yeah, I sure will. Try
Thank you,
to.
sir.
Yep.
So NIOSH's recommended exposure limit is 2,000 times lower than the OSHA PEL. Go figure. That's usually the case with a lot of the chemical exposures, the PELs. And in addition to that, it's got a 10-hour workday instead of an 8. So it offers a little bit more robustness in its protection because it's a longer exposure period. So its levels are 0.001. And in OSHA's were 0.1 and 0.5. Also, I do have a real prop here. So here's the 2020 ACGIH TLV. They do have limits in there as well, the TLVs, but they're the same values as OSHA. There's different options to test for PCB health risks. You can look at air and materials testing at work sites. So I can either take air samples or I can do direct bulk sampling and testing of material. All of us have some background level, as we looked at yesterday, of PCBs in our body, unfortunately. If you're going to test for worker exposure for that PEL or to apply it to like the TIV or the NIOSH REL, you're going to use NIOSH sampling method 5503. And that's going to go, off to a lab. And again, these NIOSH methods, I might have mentioned this before in some of my classes. It's really the direction manual or the recipe guide of how you can validly take a worker exposure sample. And that's the way that we have to do that. And that's if we do it that way and we document so, if ever we have to go to court to protect workers, we did it the right way. If you don't do it the right way, your data could be thrown out. And then what the lab's going to do is they're going to run it through that gas chromatograph machine that I was talking about. That's going to create these peaks and valleys and determine what the worker's exposure was. Non-liquid PCB material must be managed as PCB bulk waste when removed from service for disposal. Dried paints, caulking, things like that. Here we've got a couple examples of workers doing some caulking removal, with protection, and particularly the person on the right here, they're using some vacuum capture to help make sure that this stuff doesn't become a fugitive emission. Good practice. EPA guidance for coal tar wrap. This was a letter that was sent to Keyspan in 2006. It was never authorized by the EPA to use as a preventative material for preventing corrosion. And once it's found, it has to be removed. I showed this before already. This again is just a way that we're going to look at remediating waste and what's going to have to happen to it, about where it can go, what some of your action levels are, et cetera. And during the worker course, like I said, we're really going to get into this and have some folks do some work with the standard. The definition of a PCB remediation waste, again, out of 761, you have these cutoff values less than 50, greater than 50. You've got some different time periods associated with this, pre-1978 and post-78. And then you've got spillage, and it determines if it's a PCB remediation waste or not. So we can see, let's take one. Let's say if you've got something that's greater than 50 ppm, no matter when it was spilled. If it was spilled back in the day and you found through historical record you had something buried in the ground, or if you were cleaning up, say, a library and you had 175 ppm mixed PCB waste that was spilled, it counts. The source at any concentration. So it doesn't matter. Let's say you were removing caulking that had, a mixture of parts per million, and you're putting that all in the same container. It doesn't matter, what that new amount is going to be. So the source at any time, it came from different sources. Once that stuff was spilled, it's going to be considered a PCB remediation waste. So, this kind of brings to mind that it's prudent for a contractor and for a building or project owner to do things right off the bat, right? Regardless whether or not we might not have a certain requirement to do stuff beforehand. It's a good idea to do things, protect the environment, protect the public, protect workers right off the bat. That way there, you're not going to have anything unfortunate happen if you did have an accidental release. So one of the issues is, where can we get rid of the stuff once we find it? So you don't have a lot of options. You can incinerate PCBs, and there's none of these incinerators that are licensed in the Pacific Southwest. There are very few landfills that you can bring these things to. You can use a high efficiency boiler. There's none in the Pacific Southwest in the country. Scrap metal recovery, ovens and smelters, none in the Pacific Southwest. And you can decontaminate PCBs from materials. EPA is going to inspect approved facilities that store, treat, or dispose of it. And they're going to do it based on an order of operation, follow up on a complaint. So let's say if, a resident or a worker might have a complaint for one of those facilities, and there's different sources of complaints that they're going to look at. EPA's focused targeted enforcement criteria. They're going to look at approved facilities, ships and vessels. They're going to, look at enforcement for follow-up on complaints, and then identifying potential companies with large sources of PCBs. They're going to look at those organizations under a magnifying glass. So, for example, anybody that might have been connected to Monsanto, any of those operations, those are going to get looked at a little closer. Again, just like with OSHA, although EPA is a little better funded, there's not an unlimited amount of field inspectors. So they've got to prioritize how they're going to look for this stuff. So some use regulations, if you're currently using a PCB product, it's got to be enclosed with no leaks. Transformers have to be labeled over 500 ppm. If it's taken out of service, there's a time limit and there's a methodology for how you can appropriately dispose of that material. Sampling for PCBs in soil is required under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, to determine, how much of that stuff might be in there, what the depth of it is. Do you have to remediate down a few inches, to, 4 feet? What are we talking about? So there's a methodology for how you're going to go through and conduct samples. These are the 2 EPA testing methods, which depend, which one you use depends upon, what form the PCBs are in and how they're found. And in the worker class, we're actually going to do some work with these, some of these testing methods, so that folks, that might be doing abatement stuff have a really good handle on how this kind of stuff is done. Removal is carried out in response to the EPA hazardous waste regulations. So at greater than or equal to 50 ppm, materials then have to be properly, handled as a PCB waste. Demolition waste in a non-liquid state, so something like caulking, dry coatings, things like that, is regulated. And if it's 50 ppm or more, it's got to be handled and disposed of as hazardous waste. And then we've got remediation waste like soil, gravel, sediment, things like that. Wood window frames. Let's say if you've got caulking and it absorbed into that frame, it's also hazardous waste if it's 50 ppm or more. So 50 is really the cutoff where we start to classify stuff as a PCB hazardous waste. Oh, hey, I got another prop. Oh, I miss being in class. So you're probably all familiar with these little guys, right? So it's also regulated under, DOT. There's a guide number for it. It's got an ID identifier number as well. We're not going to look at this today, but if I was, in class, I would actually have, folks look up, in the book, talk about how this book is useful, what that information is, and it's really just for, transportation incidents. But it's very important that we label these things correctly when we do ship them, right? Because we want to try to, if there is an incident, an accident during shipping, we want to make sure that responders have the right information quickly so that they can determine what they need to do to protect themselves. It's classified under Class 9. There are warning signs to identify PCBs. We have to make sure that we're using these. Okay, so there's new pre-demo. Okay, so what I want to get into now is I added this stuff in from the original course. So Wayne and Jim, we didn't show this during the time we ran this in the summer. This is some good news. So even though the feds have dragged their feet on PCBs, states are starting to get, as I said, pretty strict. So there's new demolition PCB regulations in the San Francisco Bay Area. So it's under the Bay Area Stormwater Management Agency Association. PCBs and priority building materials, and the definition of priority building materials is listed in their rule, requires model screening. So it was in effect last year. And I think Wayne and Jim might have sent this news article off when I first found this to you guys and Tom and Anton, and covers buildings between 1950 and 1980. And there's actually a long checklist. What you have to do if you're going to be doing demolition, you have to go and fill out this checklist and then submit that to the BASMAA, and then they will grant you license to do the demolition project. So what does this mean? It means a bunch of contractors out in the San Francisco Bay Area have to now understand what PCBs are, and at least at an awareness level, but more realistically to a greater depth, because if they go and do the assessment and they find they have PCBs, that's going to trigger a whole bunch of other requirements under the state. This is an example of the city of Santa Clara. This is their guide that they put out. This is an example of the flow chart. It's a little fuzzy. It actually looks kind of fuzzy in their guide. But this is a good place if you want to go and kind of see what some of the more forward-looking areas are starting to do. Massachusetts is doing the same, Washington State. So at some point, and it looks to be sooner than later, especially, believe me, with all these, these very heavily priced lawsuit settlements against, Monsanto, Bayer, et cetera, for PCBs, it's a short matter of time before public health, environmental health groups in different states start to look at this stuff and say, hey, it's time to do something, right? So again, a good opportunity, I think, for the IUPAT to get a jump on this, train our members up, train our contractors. What's nice is it seems like the IUPAT, and correct me if I'm wrong, we've got a fairly nice relationship with our contractors compared to some other unions. And I think it's a great opportunity, educate them and get them on board. And as Wayne and Jim have said to me many times, hey, this is a good, money-making opportunity that also provides a public good. How great is that, right? All right, that's the end of day number 2. Worker rights, regulations, etc. Any comments or questions, anything that we can discuss before we get into our activity?
So Bernie, that one slide you had a while back where the EPA is watching, like National Grid and a few others.
Yep.
I know National Grid we have a couple contractors working for National Grid down in the Boston area. And they are self-enforcing their own classroom time for PCBs. So they've come up with their own program, but they're very interested, like the Egan company in Boston, they do most of the work there for National Grid. And what it is any type of refinery where they've got gas piping and everything. They bought all their wraps and everything from Monsanto, basically. So that's why they're being enforced to train their workers.
Yeah, I mean, it especially with how this is in the news. And I don't know if I did a news search when we did the last class in the summer this year, but I didn't think there would be a lot of stuff showing during the pandemic. But when I looked at stuff yesterday and this morning, I was actually shocked with the amount of current news articles about PCBs. And tomorrow I'll show a couple more that specifically deal with building construction, with current building construction news articles about finding PCB contaminated building material. And it gets really expensive. It gets a lot more expensive after the fact, right? It's always harder to redo something and to clean up something than it is to do it right the first time. And again, if we can bring this to our contractors and say, hey, look, this is a great chunk of work. It might save you some headaches in the future, because we've got some examples of, general contractors going ahead and then discovering PCBs and projects stopping. And again, Wayne and Jim had a lot of good insight about this, about how it's great for a contractor to understand what PCBs are, where they're found, and what it takes to abate them, because it could lead to a good source of work. Wayne, Jim, any comments or questions? Anything you want to add of the stuff that we covered? I know regulations are kind of boring, but we need them, unfortunately, to make employers, protect us at some time. And this one's particularly muddled, PCBs.
Well, my only comment is, and I know Jim and I have talked about this, and along with you, Bernie, is you go to OSHA and you talk to them about them, and they basically wash their hands from it, because they're just putting out, hey, we're just regulating what you can be exposed to. We have no standard to enforce it. So they kick it back to the EPA. And I think that's just important for people to realize that, OSHA is very limited on what they can do right now.
Right.
What about the general duty clause?
You're right.
Yep. In fact, Jim has mentioned that during our discussions on PCBs at least every other time, or at least every third or fourth time.
I hadn't said anything this time, Bernie.
That's okay. Well, I was waiting for you.
Well,
You must have texted Dave and said, ask the question.
Put it in there sneakily, right?
I worked for a contractor for a lot of years, 27 years. And now I'm working for the union. It's still, if you are exposing your employees to a hazard and you don't test for it, you're liable for it as a contractor.
Yeah.
Am I right, Bernie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I've done 2 presentations in front of the EPA and OSHA here in Arkansas and in Texas. And OSHA comes back and tells us each time, what do you want me to do about it? I can't do nothing. But the EPA people are eating it up. They're wanting this to go on forward because it helps their cause. It helps all of our causes.
Yeah. So with the Pels, I mean, again, a contractor has to, or a union, a local union has to have, connection somehow to health and safety professional. Most small contractors don't. And a lot of the large ones that I've worked around, because usually it was for, you know, a labor group on their side of the fence, they might not have a qualified person. So even though there's only a Pell under OSHA, that does carry with it some significant requirements. So if you're over the Pell, what does the OSHA standard tell us to do? Well, it requires us, and again, I'm not talking about just that, you know, the Pell for PCBs. There's now a chain of events that has to occur if you are exposed, if you're exposing a worker above a Pell. You've got to provide what? Engineering controls first to try to get that reduced. In the meantime, you put them in a respirator. So that contractor better have a respiratory protection program ready to go, which includes everything from training, fit testing, written program, medical evaluation. And then they've got to make sure that they're implementing those engineering controls. And after that, you know, admin controls to get their exposure down. So there are some things that do get triggered if that Pell gets superseded. But as we showed, it's a carcinogen. It provides a lot of nasty other damaging effects, like, you know, teratogenic effects, et cetera. So unless you've got a contractor, you know, that knows, that's why it's good to be a member of a union. You know, hopefully with even the general basic EHS classes that we might teach members when they're apprentices and things like that, you know, hopefully they might know enough at least to run it up to the chain to their steward or something like that and say, hey, I might be concerned, you know, you know, with this this PEL, it looks like I might be close to it or above it. What can we do? And then the union can at least get involved and tell the contractor, hey, you know, you got to be doing something about this, right? But again, you know, not for nothing, but smaller businesses and stuff like that, they don't know about this. You know, larger businesses don't know about this. So with that said, what I want folks to do is grab their activity 3. Oh, you know what we didn't do, guys, Wayne and Jim? Well, maybe it's because I put in the activity. We'll let the activity cover it. We're going to let the, so there's number 7 in the activity. It's a ringer. It's going to be a tough discussion because of the fact we actually don't have a worker protection rule for PCBs. So what happens if you find out that there are PCBs on site, but nobody has to test for them? All right, so let's go ahead. Manisha, if you want to break us into groups and
Okay,
just
how many
keep
minutes?
Wayne and Jim and myself out of them. Let's give them 20 minutes to answer
Okay.
these questions. Activity 3, and then we'll come back and we'll debrief this together, and we'll talk about that activity, that number 7.
All right, Bernie, we have everyone back.
All right. All right, folks, I guess I'll just leave, won't bother going back to the presentation. So I'll use the slides if we have to look up some answers or something, but all right, so let's get into this. List the EPA rule that regulates PCBs.
I got 40 CFR 761.
Yep, good. List the legally approved waste disposal methods for PCB. So, or you can even do like what regulation covers those.
Have incinerate, landfill, high efficiency boiler, scrap metal recovery and smelters, and decontamination.
Yep, good. And again, you know, there's not a lot of physical places to send this stuff. It's very limited. Let's see, list
Hey,
and all that
Bernie?
stuff's covered under rec. Yeah. Wayne?
Just thinking about that, you know, you were talking about that walkway. Where was that? On one of those new slides, you were saying that they found it in the, yeah. Well,
Newburyport, Mass.
probably, yeah, because a lot of our coal slag goes back into feedstock. So it may have come from, you know, a bridge or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's, I was just thinking about that.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you know, the ways which waste material was used for fill around the country is interesting when you start to dig into it.
Yeah, because Pike Industries used to buy a lot of the coal slag from here in the Northeast and put it right back into their road material.
Right, right. Let's see, how about number 3? List the OSHA Pell and the NIOSH REL for PCBs. Do they agree And do you think that the OSHA one adequately protects workers? And first off, I'll say that the NIOSH value was incorrect. It should be 0.001 milligrams per cubic meter, not ppm.
They don't agree, and we think that it was because the NIOSH recommendation was from laboratory, and the OSHA one was negotiated.
Mhm. Yeah, is anybody familiar with what happened in the mid 80s to what we call the vacated PELs? So the OSHA PELs, when the OSHA Act was enacted in 1970, what OSHA did is they said, look, we need some exposure limits. So believe it or not, a lot of industry had their own exposure limits because some places did track their workers getting sick. And so they came up with their own exposure limits. There was some other ones from some other federal agencies. And then lo and behold, we have the OSHA PELs, but they're ancient. They're back from 1970. In the early 80s, they came up with some new strict PELs for certain chemicals. And industry didn't like that. And they sued OSHA and they won. And their argument was you did not prove that your new PELs are going to be any more protective than the old PELs, and you didn't account for feasibility. So the Supreme Court sided with them. So in the back of this pocket guide here, you can actually find the old vacated PELs. So they're negotiated is a good term. These I call these things allowable poisoning limits, for lack of a better term, because you take something like PCBs or lead that, they're carcinogenic, they cause multiple health hazards. We really should be shooting for zero exposure. Yet there's, somewhat of a significant high limit that we're allowed to be exposed to. And to me, practicing industrial hygiene, caring about, worker well-being, it's just not appropriate. So negotiate is a pretty good term. And unfortunately, one of our federal government's attempts at getting some more protective values back in the 80s failed. Anybody else want to comment or question about that? How about number 4, agree or disagree? PCBs are only a concern for worker exposure and worker health.
Disagree.
Disagree. Yeah. How come?
The EPA wouldn't be involved if it wasn't.
What was that?
Well, the EPA wouldn't be involved if it wasn't a concern for the environment.
Right. And not just the environment, but as far as like, water and air and wildlife, but people. So, one of the things that the EPA does is protect public health, right? That's why we've got such strict standards for, handling lead or asbestos building materials. Good. Since there is no dedicated OSHA regulation that protects those who work with PCBs, such as there is with lead or asbestos, list and describe the tools that OSHA could use to protect workers who are exposed.
I put down the HAZCOM standard.
Yep, that's one.
They could use some stipulations in there, or it's something as simple as the general duty clause. That if it was a known hazard.
Yep, the general
we
duty
should have been
clause is
protected.
And here's an argument. So, if you've been doing, contracting work for a long time, dealing with coatings and caulking and stuff like that, there's trade magazines that business owners get and all that stuff. Don't you think they know about the issue of PCBs to some extent? If they know about it, shouldn't they be looking at protecting workers, from it? So there's an argument there, I think that labor can make. Yeah, you should know about it. When I embark on just the hobbies that I like, I learn all I can about what it is I'm about to do. One, to determine if I'm going to like doing it or not, and then I try it. But two, figure out how to do it well. So it does go for something to be, an expert at something or to be good at it. You want to do your research. So it could be argued that employers should know about this stuff if they're going to be handling this material. Let's see. Next one, number 6. So I've got a table again. And again, this is just a matching one. So why don't you shout out the, the letter you get? What was class 9?
Jake.
Jay.
J, yep, good. The US DOT hazard label, and wait, where was it here? J. Where's my J? Yeah, US DOT hazard labeling and placarding, designating PCBs. How about NIOSH 5503?
Aye.
Yep, that's how NIOSH says that we should sample for this stuff. How about TSCA?
A,
Yep, good. How about OSHA?
H,
H, yep. They've got enforceable PELs. What's number 40 mean in this context?
G,
G, yep, that's a number of states that have fish advisories.
That's supposed to be AA.
Yeah, yep.
that's supposed to be AA, correct?
Yes, it is. CAA. Clean Air Act. Let's see.
C.
And what, yep, C, good. How about CWA?
D,
D, good. 2 ppm?
F,
F, yep. That's nuts that we can have that much in our food. How about NRC? I'm
E,
sorry, NCR.
E,
E, good. And greater than or equal to 50 ppm.
B,
B.
Good. All right. And again, if workers go through, your participants go through this activity, and the ones that we had prior to and what we're going to do tomorrow, you'd be pretty confident that they're going to be able to go out and understand at a basic level, some of the issues with PCBs, and at least be able to bring this up to, their local union leadership, their steward or whatnot. So and that's what we're looking for. Which brings us to this number 7, which is the tricky one. And this is the one that I'm, really concerned about in Jim and Wayne. We've had discussions about this. We talked about, doing some kind of a reporting fact sheet or sort of like a helping fact sheet for workers that might be in this predicament. So you and your coworkers will be removing and replacing hundreds of linear feet of cracked and peeling caulking from a library that was built in 1975. You were concerned with the date of the building and understand that some of the building materials may contain PCBs, especially the caulking. You learn that there have not been any tests to determine the presence of PCBs in the library. When you bring this up to the site foreman, he tells you that they don't have to test for PCBs by law and to get started with the work. You next state that you would like to wear PPE and use engineering controls to reduce your exposure risk in case PCBs are present. The foreman says that you cannot use PPE or engineering controls because you would scare the library's administrative staff and community members who frequent the library, and that you better stop causing trouble for them. What do you do? Explain in detail your response and your next steps.
Box.
First thing we talked about was maybe try to sneak a little chunk of that caulk in a plastic bag or something. Maybe see if we can get some testing done on our own.
Yep.
Me personally, I wouldn't do the work until I knew I was safe. So I would refuse to do the work and encourage my coworkers to do the same. But they're adults, they can make their own decisions. I would call my business agent, maybe try to get legal involved to see if we would need to call the EPA, OSHA, any other local agencies, get them involved. But maybe, maybe there's nothing. So maybe getting that testing done, just wearing your own PPE on your own merit, and just getting yelled at for a day or so until you can figure out how to get that stuff tested. Because I would hate to lose my job and start a big battle and find out there's nothing in the caulking.
Yep.
we kind of, in our group, we kind of talked about it and we figured one of two things. Vacuum, using a vacuum as you're scraping it as you go along, because that seems to be a little less alarming as, for everybody else that's watching, if that was one of the concerns. But, and this was kind of like out of left field, there's no mention of the employer on there. So maybe speak to the employer, educate them on the subject and have that foreman removed.
Yep.
Or replaced.
Yep. Good answers.
We could
Anybody
do
else?
Chain of command, safety officer, go to the job steward, go to the union house. See if you can get some help that way.
And again, this is an important question, especially if we're going to be, delivering this class to a lot of our members, and the goal is to get them to remember this material and be able to implement it out in the field, right? That's what we want to do. So if that is really being done, if we did our job as instructors, this scenario could likely come up quite often, So one of the things too is we can remember back to the respiratory protection standard, right? Under Appendix D, if a worker wants to wear a respirator for whatever reason for their job, they are allowed to do so by law. And that employer does have to follow a couple components of that respiratory protection standard. So really, the supervisor here cannot say no, right, to that worker if they wanted to put a respirator on. But again, you got to know the nuances of this stuff, right? And ideally, as I don't have my names up here yet, as Justin said, let's try to get it tested. I mean, that it removes a lot of issues for us as workers, but it creates a potential huge issue for the building owner or project owner. And again, we'll look at some building examples tomorrow, but after the fact, when a project was started and PCBs were discovered, the brakes went on and the costs went way up, and as as Wayne mentioned before, when we first started doing this, it's really good for contractors to know this because they're actually bringing more value to the table within their bid and to that project owner by understanding these things and not having this happen, And again, it's hard because it's like, at some point, it's going to get found out that you've got that stuff in your material, whether it's this project this year or 5 years from now, a different project.
Bernie, after here,
So when they test it at the landfill, they're gonna find out. And
You cut out.
Harry, yeah, you're right. It's gonna be tested sooner or later. I would just wear my own respirator and just do it.
Bernie, hearing to what both Justin and Nuno said about whether or not, just bringing a vac in and stuff like that, instead of throwing gas onto the fire right now, say, hey, look, how about if we use glove bags and HEPA vacs? It's going to give the illusion that we're just not willing to make a mess. That's a cheap alternative. We're not going to shut things down, but we would appreciate or need you to get this tested, but we'll move forward.
Yeah.
I mean, that give them a solution instead of just putting their backs up against the wall too sometimes.
Yeah, and OSHA, you do have the right to refuse hazardous work, but
Right.
OSHA's got kind of like a little guide on how to do that. And within that guide, and it's not talked about a lot, unfortunately, I would like to see OSHA do something a little stronger for workers, so workers can say, hey, look, I followed, the requirement that OSHA said if we have to do this, because that gives them some, protection, right? But in their guide, it does say, don't refuse not to work, just refuse not to do that job that way. So I agree with you, Wayne. If you can find a solution that will at least reduce your risk for that day, maybe it can give that supervisor some time to think about a better alternative. And it is nuts. I mean, look, I've done a lot of mold inspection, and when I was young in my career, I got a pretty nasty sinus infection from breaching a wall, going behind the wall and taking some samples because there's a little bit of a difference in pressure between behind the wall and the room that I'm in. And so I got a little puff of that air behind there, and I got pretty sick. So after that, I started using a respirator when I would just, breach the wall and take my couple samples and I would take it off. Let me tell you how quickly people get freaked out when they're in a regular office building and I'm in there with a respirator. And at one time I had a pretty heated discussion with the building manager and of a job. So after that, and I got my way, but after that I started putting in my contracts every time, we'll use the appropriate, PPE and hazard controls to protect, myself when I'm conducting work. And there's a line in there every contract, so that, they can't say, sorry, you can't do the work now all of a So it does cause a stir. That's why it's always good to be open. So if you are doing some rental work on a library, there could be a little campaign for the community that says, hey, we're doing some renovation work. There are some PCBs, make sure we're taking them out of there, blah, blah, blah. We're doing it the right way. That's much better than, hey, I just found out that you did an abatement and that my kids go there all the time. And it was later found out there was PCBs there. What gives? That does not sound like a fun conversation to have as a town administrator or something, Any other comments or questions on this one?
Yeah, I kind of like that question because guys like me, we've worked commercially for years. Appearances do mean a lot on those projects, especially if it's an existing business that's up and running.
Yeah.
So we do get the arguments in class of, why is my contractor making me buy new whites for this project? Or why are they asking us not to wear our union shirts on this project and things like that. And it always ends up being kind of a heated discussion. So
Yeah.
We've got to work with them a little bit and we got to pick our battles, but safety like this, like everybody else will say, I would protect myself or find some alternative way to do it.
I guarantee you, at least through experience in my classes, in a situation like this, the first question that would be asked was, if I get laid off from this job from opening my mouth, are you going to have my back?
Yeah.
Because technically that would be the first thing that would happen.
Right.
Yep.
In reality, a lot of people are afraid to speak up and protect themselves because unfortunately, if they don't do the job, somebody else will.
Yeah. And a lot of those things are hard to prove. So the reality is, we'll fight for them in court, but are we going to win? Probably not, because the contractor's going to say, well, we ran out of work for them or something like that.
Yeah.
And again, so, this is such an important question. And realistically, I think that there should be a module that's just based on not this question, but the intent of the question about how do you protect your rights on a job in sticky situations like this. We know that OSHA has 11C. An employer is not allowed to discriminate or retribute against a worker for exercising their health and safety rights, but it's difficult to prove. And but it's a good thing that they are. It's a good thing to tell your apprentices and stuff, hey, you are a member of a union and we do have your back. I mean, I can tell you the reason why I didn't do that much private non-union consulting in the past was because it broke my heart to see what some of these workers would go through. And I would always speak up. And they're like, well, you're not here for that, Bernie. Yeah, but I'll tell you what. It's my ethical obligation to point out that you're doing something wrong. And a union just makes it easier. And this is a good question that can really talk about, solidarity. And when you look at, labor history, one of the first reasons for, unionization wasn't for a better paycheck and vacation. It was because people literally were not coming home from jobs, right? So we never want to forget one of our cornerstones of the labor movement is protecting workers. And so this question gets at it, and I can see it coming up and creating some really good discussions in classes. And I don't have an answer, that's black or white. I can give you a bunch of gray stuff, right?
But at the end of the day, in our position, and I think I speak for all of us, we have to just be able to give all our knowledge to our members. That's really how you're going to arm them to come up with the situation where, okay, let's just use a vacuum. It's inexpensive. It's not going to cut into the bottom line. It's not going to scare anybody away, but they have to know about these methods so they can get the job done and not end up getting in trouble, because eventually they will. Because they'll just have some other excuse or work slow down or whatever the reason may be, and somebody else will end up there.
Yeah. And again, one of the things that I mentioned, Wayne and Jim, you'll probably remember when we were at the main campus there 2 years ago in the summer, would a member know where to go for help? And then where would they go for help? And I got it depends answer. It depends which district council they're in and what kind of job it is. And I was getting confused, so do all of our members know where to go for help? Because something like this could be really scary. You know what I mean? And if you bring up and extend this question to the fact that they might be getting contamination on their clothes and bringing that home to their family, it's, you know, that it gets compounded, right? So this is a tricky one, you know.
I guarantee you in some of these district councils, you could probably go 2 hours on this question alone.
Yeah, it's a good one. I think it's an important one, and I thank everybody for you know, for chiming in with their thoughts on it. With that said, that's the end of the module today. Does anybody have any comments, questions, anything they want to talk about?
I was just wondering if there are any trigger tasks for PCBs.
You mean like if I'm about to do this, we got to make sure we test for it or something? No, you know, you figure that would be removing caulking and stuff like that. There are, once you identify PCBs are there. So it all comes down to the initial test. And again, I'll try to get a better answer on that for tomorrow. And it's prudent that we do so, because going forward, you know, teaching another one of these and then, you know, starting to do the worker class, we'd like to really have some good concrete examples. Who knows, maybe I can even get you know, an OSHA interpretation letter on this.
I was wondering if there are any like historic airborne values.
Yeah, so I mean, a New York City public school system, they determined that they had significant PCB exposure from building materials because they were getting high airborne levels. I don't know why they decided to sample the air, but they did. And then there was, you know, the teachers union won a pretty good protective case on getting all the ballast out of the New York City school system. It drives me nuts that, you know, workers and you know, we have to get protections after something bad happens. I hate that. Well, how come we can't just be proactive? You know, how does that phrase go? A ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You know, but anyway, other comments or questions? Tomorrow, we're going to actually look at some good news. We're going to look at some stuff about how to control these things, how to prevent it. We're going to look at a couple of specific building case studies towards the end of the module. And then we'll, I can't remember, Nicole or Wayne, Jim, did we do the evaluation at the end of Friday or at the end of tomorrow?
We could actually do it tomorrow. Brian.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, Manisha. Yeah. All right. Sounds good. All right, folks, if you don't have anything else, we'll see you tomorrow at 10.
All right, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.